Hello everybody, I am AJ Soccer from NewmontGaming.com, and today I'm going to teach you how to start playing Magic Online. Now, first you need to know that Magic Online is potentially a very large investment, as you have to own digital cards and build decks much like you do with paper cards in real life. Also, it is a bulky, Windows-only program with a user interface that can take some getting used to, though I'll be helping with that last part. If that doesn't sound like what you want, I highly recommend checking out Magic Duels. This is Magic's free-to-play program available for a variety of platforms. I might do a video specifically about Duels at some point, but for now, if you're newer to Magic, I highly recommend exploring that first. To get started with Magic Online, first go to the Magic Online page, which you can shortcut to with mtgo.com. The first thing you have to do is make an account. This will cost you $10, but you get some of that back in digital product on your new account. Enter in your info, get the activation code email, and your account is live. Be sure to use a real and secure email. Don't worry, they won't spam you, and having the account attached to your actual email will save you lots of potential headaches down the road. I also highly recommend not tempting fate when creating your screen name. If a username gets past the initial censor but is deemed offensive later, at best they'll change your screen name to Magic Player and a string of numbers that you'll then have to memorize, and at worst they will simply terminate your account with no refunds. You can download the client by clicking this button or by going back to mtgo.com. This can take quite a while to install and update, but once it finally does, you'll be able to log in. The first time you log in with your account, Magic Online will ask you some questions. The first question is about legality of prize eligibility, which can vary from state to state as well as country to country. I've never actually heard of this being a problem for anybody outside of Germany, but it doesn't hurt to double check. The next question is about legality of player rewards. As long as you are in the United States and don't work for Wizards of the Coast, then go ahead and check yes at the top. The mailing list is totally optional, but I actually recommend opting in. They only send one email a month, and it actually has some pretty interesting and useful information in it, such as scheduling for things like upcoming cubes, as well as some data from the current draft format. This will be your homepage. It's mostly advertisements for the latest products and news about the goings-on in the Magic world. This is also where your buddy list will be along the bottom. The way that you navigate through Magic Online is with these tabs along the top. As you can see, we're currently home, but let's go to our collection tab. Here we see we don't have any cards, but if you click the Other Products tab, there is the New Player Pack waiting for us. Crack that puppy open and bathe in your spoils. It comes with some avatars, some cards, some event tickets, and some new player tickets. You'll learn about all those in due time, but now let's go back to our Cards tab. The Collection tab is made up of 4 sections: Filters, the main card window, the lower card window, and the Decks and Binders menu. You can readjust the size of these windows with these little handles. Let's look at the main card window options. You can use the display drop-down to pop out a preview pane, a separate window that you can drag and resize that will show you a blown-up version of the card you mouse over. Also under display is the option to change from this, the card view, to a list view, though I don't know anyone that actually uses that. Much more useful is the quantity menu, which gives you this double slider to filter the cards shown by the number of copies in your collection. For example, sliding this right nub down shows only cards that I own exactly 1 copy of. And extremely handy is sliding the left nub to 0, showing all of the cards on Magic Online, even if you don't own any. As you can see, along with the number 0, they are also faded slightly to indicate that they're not actually there. The Versions tab lets you filter out different versions of cards, while Show Versions separately will do exactly that. You can see that my 1 pile of 60 forests have become 4 piles of 15 forests of each art. Versions include alternatives like that, as well as different printings from different sets, foil versions versus non-foil versions, and promo copies versus normal cards. The Sort menu lets you choose how to organize the card window by name, color, converted mana cost, rarity, or set and collector number. And lastly, the slider at the top lets you change the size of the cards in the window. In addition to this slider and the pop-out preview pane, you can also get a closer look at cards by mousing over them and holding both right and left click at the same time. If you have a mouse made after 1996, you can also hold the scroll wheel to middle click. Both of those options have a slight risk of mistakenly clicking the card you're trying to zoom in on, which can be detrimental while drafting. So I recommend getting in the habit of holding down the zoom button on your keyboard, which is Z by default, and mousing over. To control what is shown in the main card window, you'll use these filters on the left. You can filter by format legality, setter expansion, color, which will also include additional options for color identity, card type of course, and you can see it kept my other filter, so now it only shows white creatures. Subtype, so now it only shows white creatures that are angels. CMC, or converted mana cost, gives us another double slider to narrow the range of mana costs of cards, and a checkbox to decide whether or not to include X spells such as Blaze. You'll also get a double slider for power and toughness, with a checkbox for asterisk values such as seen on Marrow. And the final filter is rarity. Then you can simply undo it all by clicking Reset Filters at the top. Now let's take a look at the bottom half of the screen where you will build your decks and binders. The far bottom left has buttons for new deck or binder, which you can also see here. When you click new deck, you'll get this window where you can choose a deck box, import a deck if you have one saved, select a format, and of course name it. Once you hit OK, this bottom window becomes your deck. So we go back to the top half of the screen to construct our deck, and I'll start by filtering to white cards and sorting by converted mana cost. To add cards, you can double click, hold and drag, or right-click the card where in one of the options will be Add to Deck. When you right-click a card, the drop-down menu will give you varied options for convenience, such as add 4 copies, or 10 in the case of basic lands. Now I'll throw a sample deck together and you can see cards dim to indicate no additional copies in your collection. Now the deck is in the bottom, but not in the most viewable format. But if you right-click, you'll get options, the most useful of which is Sort by Converted Mana Cost, which will lay your deck out in curve. You can drag boxes to select multiple cards, move them to the upper window to take them out of your deck, or the right window which makes up your sideboard. In addition to dragging, you can also add cards to your sideboard in the right-click menu. Don't forget that you might not see some lands or artifacts you might want to use in your deck if you have filters on. This little yellow yield sign next to my deck's name indicates that it isn't legal yet. It also appears here alongside my deck's stats. As you can see, the deck is only 59 cards. Instead of resetting filters and finding a plains, I can simply right-click and select Add Land to Deck, which brings up this handy window of basic lands. You can choose how many of each you want, and there's even a Suggest Lands button, though I don't recommend relying on that as it has some significant shortcomings. Click Add to Deck and voila, the yield signs are gone. One of the most helpful features in deck building is this right-click drop-down menu. Here you can delete your deck or export it, which lets you save the deck as a local file on your computer in either a Magic Deck file, a plain text file, or spreadsheet CSV file format. This is helpful for a number of things, including sharing lists with friends. The Properties option opens this, which lets you change the name, format, or deck box of your deck. The Sample Hand tab gives you an opening 7 from your deck, though the interface isn't very useful and even uses a faux shuffling algorithm, so I don't recommend using this tool and instead suggest Solitaire mode, which I'll teach you in a minute. The last tab in the Properties menu is Analysis, which gives you these simple numbers. The top option in that deck right-click menu is Open a new copy of this deck. This is an extremely useful tool, and I'll tell you why. Magic Online decks autosave every change that is made to them, so if you make some test tweaks that you don't end up liking, you have to go back in and undo those tweaks. That is, unless you use this tool. As you can see, it gave me a new deck identical to White Aggro called White Aggro 2, which I can then go into Properties and change to something more descriptive. I'm going to try a version with Totem Guide Heartbeasts, so I'll note that in the name. Now, I passed over this earlier because too many people become reliant on it and never learn how to use filters to help browsing, but just under Reset All Filters is a typable search bar. Note that whatever filters you have on will also apply to this search. You don't have to search the card name either. A search for Antelope will also find the Totem Guide Heartbeast, as well as a fragment of its rule text, or even its stats. I right-click in the lower window and sort by converted mana cost, then go back to the top window and double-click the Heartbeasts. As you can see, they slide right into the 5-drop, and now I have 2 versions of the deck saved, one with the Heartbeasts and one without, so I can test one without deconstructing the other. If a card is in your collection, then you can have it in any number of decks and or binders as you want, which brings us to the other thing you need to be able to do in your collection tab, binders. Binders are a lot like decks in that they are just subsets of your collection, but decks are for playing while binders are for trading. Just like decks, you can rename them and change their covers. The For Trade binder is just that, so put any cards here you might want to trade away. The other binder it starts you with is a wish list. Truth be told, I don't use this feature myself, but I can see how it would be useful for keeping track of what cards you need to finish your decks, especially because, just like decks, you can export your wish list and share it online. To make a wish list, be sure to lower your quantity to 0 to show cards you don't own. Personally, I want Najani for my White Weenie deck, so I'll add that to my wish list. If you make a new binder or look at one's properties, you'll also see an option to make it your active binder. Nobody gets to see any of your decks or binders except your active binder, and even then, only if you accept or initiate a trade invitation. You can only have one binder active at a time, and that's the one the other party will see when you trade, but more on trading later. If I really wanted a Najani for my White Weenie deck, what I would do instead of using the wish list is use the right-click Open New Copy of Deck tool and add the card there. As you can see, the card has this yellow striping effect to indicate I don't actually own it. The yellow yield sign is back, and if I right-click my deck, it will tell me why it isn't legal. Now that we know how to build a deck, let's learn how to play. Using our navigation bar at the top, we're going to go to the play lobby, which looks like this. We'll be learning about the play lobby itself a little later, but first let's go over how games are played by using solitaire mode. Just select Constructed Open Play here in the top left. Below it, choose your deck. As you can see, the one with an Ajani that I don't own that had the yellow yield sign on the other tab isn't a selectable option. You can of course choose the format, though right now we want standard. For players, choose solitaire instead of one-on-one. The buddies and watchers are some options about buddies and watchers, and match options lets you choose a one-game set or a traditional best 2 out of 3, and the amount of time on each player's match clock. If you deselect all, then there will be no match clock. Go ahead and click play and it will launch a new window with your solitaire game. In solitaire, all the turns are yours and you attack yourself. This is a great tool both for getting used to the program and for testing speculative brews that you're too embarrassed to show your friends quite yet. In order to teach you the in-game user interface, I'm going to use the traditional 1v1 screen, but I recommend playing around in solitaire mode while you're learning as it is close enough. So this is what a proper duel looks like. Just like everywhere else, you can grab the handles and readjust window sizes. Now there's a lot on this screen, so let's go over it piece by piece in excruciating detail. This is your hand. This is the battlefield. Each player has this setup: your avatar, your life total, and your screen name. Simple so far. Number of cards in player's hand, number of cards in player's library, amount of time left on player's clock. Each player has a certain amount of time to play their matches, but instead of a joint round clock like in Paper Magic, Magic Online has individual chess clocks. Whenever you have priority, your clock is running. If it hits 0, you lose not only the game, but the entire match. If this sounds scary, don't worry. They give you plenty of time as long as you're familiar with the interface, and you have this video, so you'll be fine. You'll be able to tell which player has priority as their clock is lit up and ticking down. These icons below the avatars, from left to right, represent Graveyard, Exile, Revealed, and Effects. The number, of course, is the amount of cards or objects there, and if you click the icon, it will pop out for you to look at. For example, the graveyards are popped out here. Xing out will just minimize it back to that icon, while hitting the arrow will undock the window so you can move it around and resize it as you please. The top box in the right is the game log, which documents actions in the game. The lower box is the chat. And now for the two most important parts of the interface. This is the main dialog box. Mulligan or Keep is only the beginning, as this is where you'll be doing most of your clicking. If you are ever confused as to what's going on, this should be the first place you look. And lastly, the timeline. As you can see, it's the structure of a single turn laid out from left to right. The beginning tells you what turn it is, and more importantly, whose it is. These white arrows are called stops, and they are the phases where you wish to receive priority, which is what we call it when you have a chance to do something. The white arrows along the bottom are for your own turns, and the ones along the top are for your opponent's. So with this setup, I will get the option to do something in my first main phase, the attacker step, the blocker step, and my second main phase, as well as their beginning combat step, their attacker step, their blocker step, and their end of turn step. You can't set stops in untap or cleanup, as players only receive priority in those steps on the rare cases that a trigger goes on the stack during them, and the game will do all the untap and cleanup actions for you otherwise. Here are the main rules for how priority works on Magic Online. Stops. If you have a stop set, you will get priority in that step. If you have mana floating, you'll get priority even if you don't have a stop. Whenever the opponent puts something on the stack, you will be given priority for an opportunity to respond. And lastly, you do not have to have stops set in the combat to declare attackers or blockers. The game will always stop and ask you for these when possible. The stops are there for casting spells or activating abilities. You can change your stops by clicking these white nubs to turn them off, the empty nubs to turn them on, or right-clicking for a more precise selection. They've added a lock to the right side of the timeline that you can use to prevent yourself from accidentally clicking a nub and changing your stops. Whether it is locked or not, right-clicking a phase will always give you the drop-down option to change that phase's stop. You can also do this in options, which we'll look at later. So let's start the game already. I want to mulligan this hand, so I click mulligan and get a fresh 6. I'll keep this one, so I click keep. It then automatically gives me my Vancouver Mulligan Scry by popping out a temporary zone window with my top card. You can see that I have priority, so my clock is lit up and ticking. As I said before, if you're ever lost, the first place to look will always be the dialog box, which tells me, Scry 1, for each card, click to put it on the top or bottom of your library. So I click the planes and it gives me those two options. Neat, especially because I need my third land drop. You can see the slider go to main, aka main phase 1, and my opponent plays their land. When they pass priority, I don't get priority in their main because I don't have a stop there, but I do have one in the beginning of combat, so I get priority there. The dialog box reiterates what phase we're in and that I have priority. With nothing to do, I click OK to pass back. Since there's no combat, the game skips over the attack and block steps entirely. I get priority once more on their end step thanks to my stop, and hit OK again. Now it's turn 1 of AJ Soccer's. Hey, that's us! I have no stops in my upkeep or draw step, so it goes straight to my main after giving me my card for the turn. You'll notice a little white border on most of my hand. That means these cards are clickable. The Medileap is not because there are no targets in play, so I can't cast it even if I had the mana. I click a Plains and it jumps into play. The white frame around my other lands disappears as I've made my land drop for the turn. I can click the Seeker of the Way and it will tell me to pay 1 and a white. I can tap my Plains and it pays the white, but without another mana I have to cancel, which will untap my Plains since I failed to cast it. I click OK to pass priority, and now you see the dialog box says I'm waiting for my opponent and their clock is lit up and ticking. This means that they have a stop in that phase and haven't passed priority back yet. Once they do, it moves into my second main, once again skipping over the combat steps with no combat occurring. I pass priority again and we're on to turn 2. My opponent plays a second land and casts Dragon Fodder. As you can see, a window pops up just like it did with my Scry, but this one represents the stack. It's giving me priority even though I don't have a stop set in this phase. I have no responses, so I click OK and the Dragon Fodder resolves. 2 goblins come into play with the yellow spiral graphic that signifies that they just entered the battlefield and are still summoning sick. Since they are identical, Magic Online conveniently arranged them just like it does for the lands. The Dragon Fodder itself went to the graveyard over here, and the next time I get priority, my Medileap is lit up because it is technically castable now that it has a target, even though I don't have the mana yet, and will probably refrain from pumping my opponent's creatures. I go to my second turn, play a second land, and want to finally cast the Seeker of the Way. I can click it and click the lands like before, but if I cancel, I can also click the lands first, tapping them and adding 2 white to my mana pool indicated here. If I click my Seeker, it will sink 1 white into the cost, then ask me how I want to pay the generic mana. I can click this little mana pool icon, or go to the dialog box where it will show me what my options are, which in this case is just the white. The Seeker goes on the stack, and when my opponent passes priority back, enters the battlefield with its yellow spiral of summoning sickness. Now that I'm tapped out with nothing else to do, I'm going to right click the battlefield to drop down a menu of options we'll go over in time, but right now I want to yield all until end of turn, which means to pass priority no matter what for the rest of the turn. I'm yielding all of my opportunities to get priority. As my opponent goes into their third turn, you can see the yellow spiral disappear from their creatures, indicating that they are no longer summoning sick and can attack. My opponent cast the Subterranean Scout and I let it resolve. You can see its triggered ability kind of floating around over here randomly. This just means that the opponent is in the process of putting it on the stack, usually in the form of choosing targets. Once the target is selected, we see the stack window popping up again with that ability in it. You can see indicators going outwards from the scout and inwards towards the goblins, showing what's going on. Once again, since I'm tapped out, I'm going to yield priority until end of turn. I can do this even though I don't have priority at the moment. Now we move to combat. This red zone opens up and the creatures being chosen to attack are pushed forward slightly and highlighted in red. When a decision is finalized by my opponent, they are tapped and attacking. Now, even though I yielded priority until end of turn, that only applies for stops and responses to things. I still get to declare blockers as normal. When I click on my Seeker, the unblockable goblin stays dimmed while the goblin I can block lights up. If I click it, my Seeker slides in front of it indicating a block. I can now click OK to finalize my blocks, reset blockers to start over, or just click the Seeker to reset it only. I'll go with the block and now damage happens. You can see the token I blocked is gone, felled in combat, my Seeker has a red blood indicator with a 1 showing it has taken a damage this turn, and my life total has fallen by 1 thanks to the other goblin. I go to my third turn, play my third land, and cast my freshly drawn Sandstep Outcast. When it enters the battlefield, I get the same triggered abilities window my opponent had for the Subterranean Scout, though instead of choosing a target, I need to choose to get a 1/1 flyer or a +1/+1 counter, which I do by clicking the ability and then the option I want. Once I decide, that ability goes on the stack, and I get priority to respond to my own trigger. I pass, it resolves, and I get my token. After that, I'm done for the turn, so I'm going to use the yield until end of turn again. But now that I have a creature that isn't summoning sick, it's going to ask me for attackers, even with my yield on, just like it did for blockers. But I don't want to attack yet, so I simply click OK without selecting my Seeker as an attacker. My opponent goes to their turn and attacks. I block fearlessly, and then they cast a Valakut Predator. My turn, I go to combat and declare my attackers. As you can see, they are shown to be selected by the red highlight and slight push forward. I can click them again to unattack, but once I hit OK, the deed is done and they are in there. Now that there is combat going on, I get my priority and attacker's step thanks to my stop, but pass priority to see how they block. They put the 2/2 on my 2/1, and I get priority and blocker's step because of my stop there. Time to blow them out with this Medileap. I click this spell and the dialog box says choose target creature, so I click on my target. Tap my mana to pay for the spell and it goes on the stack. But, before priority can happen, I have triggered abilities to put on the stack as well. Normally something like Prowess would just go onto the stack automatically, as it doesn't need a target like the Subterranean Scout or a choice to be made like Sandstep Outcast. But since there are two abilities triggering from the same spell, I have to choose the order in which they go on the stack. Now, it doesn't really matter whether the Seeker gets +1/+1 or gets lifelink first, but ordering triggers in this manner could end up mattering, so here's how it works. The first ability you click is the first ability that goes onto the stack. Then the other ability goes on top of it, and since the stack resolves top to bottom, the ability you click first will happen last. For example, if I click Prowess here, the Prowess trigger goes on top of the Mighty Leap, and the lifelink ability goes on top of the Prowess trigger in turn. When the players pass priority without any more responses, you can see it's the lifelink trigger that goes off first, then the Prowess trigger, and finally the Mighty Leap that started it all. If I zoom in on the Seeker, we see it is now a 3/3 lifelinker, and that blowout is enough to force a concession from our opponent. When that happens, this notification will appear saying you won. The normal dialog box now has options to draw a card, which lets the curious rabbit hold their deck a bit, though sometimes it bugs out and doesn't quite work. Reveal hand does what it says on the tin, but honestly, you should never really push this button, and I'm not even sure why it's there. The only reasons someone would want to show their opponent their hand after the game are either to brag or complain, neither of which are very sportsmanlike. The third button is the same as the one on the pop-up window, which here says begin sideboarding, but could say something along the lines of back to tournament or similar, depending on the context of the match. If you click go to sideboarding, you'll get a window like this, very similar to the deck builder under the collections tab. You'll have 2 to 3 minutes to sideboard it as indicated by this clock here, and when you're ready, hit submit deck. That'll bring you to this page while your opponent finishes their sideboarding, at which point it'll throw you back into the next game. Next, we're going to use the main navigation bar to go to this store, which looks like this. Now, I'm sure if you can use a computer well enough to be watching this video right now, then you already know how to use an online store. I just wanted to point out a couple things, the first of which is that there are all these intro packs and dual decks and pretty cool stuff, but they all look very similar to booster packs both in packaging design and titling in the store. So just be careful and triple check what you're buying is actually what you wanted, as simple mistakes happen on here all the time, as I know at my own cost. The second thing I wanted to point out is the pricing. An event ticket is $1, and this is the main currency used in Magic Online. Booster packs are $3.99, aka $4 each. Keep that in mind for later. Other than that, there's not much more to say about the store other than that they accept PayPal, which is kinda cool, but you don't need to buy anything yet. First, let's go back to the collection tab and click on other objects. You'll see here that you have some avatars, which we'll get to later, as well as some new player tickets, some event tickets, and some play points. New player tickets are used for entry into special events for newcomers, while the other two, well, the Magic Online Economy Crash Course is as follows. Event tickets can be traded and can be used to buy cards or products from other accounts. They can also be used to enter events, as its name would suggest. Play points can also be used to enter events, but function slightly differently in that they are non-transferable, meaning they can only be used to enter events. An event ticket is worth $1, and 10 play points equals 1 event ticket. An event ticket largely functions like $1, while a play point doesn't quite function like a dime. A play point is more like a gift card that's worth a dime. For example, if an event costs $8, you can pay your entry fee with 8 tickets or 80 play points. As of the time of recording, a combination of the two is not possible, so if you have 4 event tickets and 40 play points, you will not be able to enter the event. The Magic Online economy runs on the back of bots, or programs run on accounts in the marketplace that do a vast majority of the dealing in the secondary market. Newer players tend to want to put the T back in TCG, but bots are really the way to go. Their prices are set by a computer program, so they aren't trying to rip you off. Gain a small edge, sure, but it's a relatively small price to pay for the convenience and safety. The trades go quickly as you don't have to communicate and haggle with a human, and lastly, since event tickets are the only form of currency, giving change is impossible. But a bot will remember that 96 cents left over when you just need to buy an uncommon to finish a deck, and will save it for you next time you trade with them. Find a bot you like. Maybe they sponsor a streamer you watch, or you just like their username. Whatever it is, add that bot to your buddy list, along with that bot's other accounts, as most bots have multiple since you can only be in one trade at a time on Magic Online. Now that you've heard my spiel on bots, let's use our trusty old navigation bar to go to the trade tab, which brings you to this eyesore of a page. The main window is the marketplace where you'll see the messages posted. There's a search bar in the top left that will filter the messages you're seeing. If you really insist on not consorting with those of the robot race, typing human here will serve your needs. Most of the bigger bot chains will have every card you could ever need, and they obviously can't list every card they have in this message, so the search bar certainly has its limitations. The bottom part is where you can post a message of your own if you're so inclined. Along the left you can see filters for previous trade partners, your buddies, your clan, and lastly a drop-down menu of your binders to decide which is your active binder. If you don't remember binders, go back to the chapter on them in the collection tab. Pretty much no matter where you are on Magic Online, if you right-click somebody's screen name or avatar, you'll get similar options, one of which is Trade. This sends a trade invitation to them, and if they accept, a new window of that trade will pop up. As you can see, it looks like the deck building window again, but the bottom card window is split in half. This is because the top window is their trade binder and the bottom left is what you'll be receiving, while the right bottom is what they'll be selecting out of your active trade binder. The chat is on the right and bots will put their instructions here. Remember that if you're trying to buy boosters or sell cards, you have to click the other products tab to make those things visible. Once both players have what they want, you can click submit trade. Once both players do this, the page will change to a final submission page that shows clearly what both parties will be giving and receiving. If both players confirm again, the trade is finalized and goes through with no undos or takebacks. Now that you know how to trade, let's go back to the main navigation bar, skipping over account for now and going to help on the end. This is what you'd expect it to be. Most of the help section itself is written in computery troubleshooty language that's not very helpful. What is helpful is these 4 topic buttons on the left. Request reimbursement is a link to a page to report a bug for which you are seeking reimbursement. If you encounter a bug that doesn't cost you anything, such as something in the menus, you can report it here. Report player conduct is to report any exceedingly unsportsmanlike opponents for their toxic behavior. And lastly, chat with support brings you to this chat room with online response crew members, aka orcs. You can ask them about situations or usability issues, and they'll either help you out or point you somewhere that can. This option is more conveniently available to you in the far right of that main navigation bar we've been using so much in the drop-down menu, along with some other chat rooms, but suffice to say you're not going to get much good conversation here. Using the navigation bar, let's go back to account. These are all your preferences and settings, and there are a couple that are pretty important and useful, so stick with me. Display and sound settings is the first page. Remember that yellow swirl of summoning sickness? Well, you can toggle whether that is a fixed graphic or an animated spiral. Some people find it difficult to see on certain white cards and choose to have the animation, but I've never had an issue with it and find the motion distracting, if not downright nauseating. But that's just down to personal preference. What's not down to personal preference is the fact that the animation is weirdly intensive and can greatly increase lag if you don't have a super fancy gaming computer, so be warned. Animate foil treatment is the same exact thing. The animation takes up a surprising amount of resources, but as long as that isn't an issue for your computer, then it's up to you. Personally, I don't care about foils and find the movement distracting, but if you want both animations, then you better have a top-of-the-line rig. Underneath the sample card is yet another checkbox to pop out the preview pane. As for sound options, menu sounds and especially alerts are very important to have on, but in-duel sound effects are totally up to you. The game doesn't have great audio by any stretch, but they can be useful cues to know what phase you're in or just draw your focus into the match at hand. I'd recommend new players at least try playing with them on for a while, but I give that advice as someone who has had his sounds off for years. Account settings is where you'll change your password, email, and you can put something in your profile. You can also change your avatar. This is what those avatars in your new player pack were. I'm one of those guys that always plays as a female character, so if it's not the fiery redhead, then it's the sweet goth lady. You can get more avatars by playing special events such as pre-releases, and there are loads that can be purchased or traded for as well. Some are even used in specialized format, but that's another video for another time. We'll come back to input settings and in-duel settings, but first go to buddies, clan, and chat. If you don't have a clan, you can make your own here and invite your friends. If your friends already have a clan, you can ask their leader to invite you to theirs. The availability options are pretty much just parental controls, as is the checkbox at the bottom for the profanity filter, although it might be worth having on just for laughs, as the program can't discern card names from filter dodging, so it'll asterisk out cockatrice and the like. For notifications, I recommend you have at least new communications, new product delivery, major game notifications, and in-game notifications on, and buddy list sign-on off. Incoming chat message and display new chat message automatically are totally up to you, but I have both of mine off. The game history tab is super useful. The player ratings at the top are theoretically supposed to display your ELO ratings, but Wizards has enabled and disabled this feature multiple times in the past few years, so it might not be available to you. This big window will fill up with the games that you've played once you've played them. You can use the filters on the left in order to find a game you might be looking for. Assuming replays are working, you can double click a match to bring up this prompt. Choose a game and it will pop out this replay window that looks like the game window with these 3 buttons along the bottom. Play/pause, go forward 1 step or action, or go forward 1 full turn. There is no rewinding, as the replay system is literally playing the game again for you to watch. So if you miss something, then you have to close and reopen the replay and skip to it. Replays are a great tool for reviewing your play, showing your friends, and improving without having to invest in entering another event. One feature that is both extremely useful and massively underutilized is this checkbox right here. It records every single draft you do automatically as a text file on your computer at the location that you set. It's off by default, but there's no reason that it shouldn't be on and can be extremely useful. I've known Magic Online veterans with years of drafting under their belt not even know that this option existed. This is the format it saves it in, and because it is a simple text file, you can even add your finishing record or deck list or any other notes you might want for future use. Back to our accounts tab, order history and promo code history are pretty self-explanatory, and policy agreements are the 3 questions from the 2 prompts from way earlier later in this video. Now let's go back up to duel settings, which will show you the timeline that you see in-game with checkboxes for stops. As I said in the duel section, I err on the side of fewer stops and setting them in-game as needed, though I know plenty of others with different approaches. You'll just have to see what works best for you. There is an identical timeline for multiplayer games rather than 1v1 duels in case you want your stops set up differently for them. You can check this box to keep the red zone that appears in combat open all the time. This last box is about miracles. This is for an oddball mechanic from Avacyn Restored, and you will absolutely not need this option, but if for some weird reason you might in the future, now you know where it is. And finally, input settings. Since this is about hotkeys, people might be tempted to skip this section, but not only are hotkeys extremely important in Magic Online, my explanations of the hotkeys will include vital and useful information about gameplay as well, so stick with me. Now, a keen observer might notice a lot of similarities between these options and the menu when you right-click the battlefield in a duel, and that's no coincidence. You already know how a mouse works, and about middle clicking or holding the zoom button to zoom. To teach you the rest, I'm first going to have to illustrate what they mean, so let's consider some game situations. Many abilities in Magic will be May abilities, meaning you can choose to have their effect or not. Totem Guard Heartbeast is an example of exactly this. So when I cast the Antelope, it enters the battlefield and the trigger goes on the stack automatically. I have to click OK to pass priority before it then goes to resolve, at which point the game will ask me if I want to use the ability. I can answer this by clicking yes or no, or by using the corresponding hotkeys. You know about zooming already. The F1 key is help, but as of recording, this button doesn't actually do anything at all. It used to open your browser to their website's help page, which was annoying and useless, so I'm glad to see it removed. Undo is a bit of a misnomer, as you can't actually undo most of your actions. Once you cast a spell or make an attack or pass priority, then that's that. What this key should be called is the "oops, I didn't mean to tap that land" button, since that's all it can actually undo, and even then only if you haven't taken any game actions in between. Auto Tap Mana is the newest addition to Magic Online hotkeys, and it's an absolute lifesaver. Look at this game state. I have 2 Windscarred Crags, a Scoured Barrens, a Foundry of the Consuls, and some basics. If I click a basic, it will just tap for mana. But if I click the Scoured Barrens, it will ask me if I want it to make white or black mana. But if I'm holding M when I click it, it simply taps for white. The Windscarred Crag asks me if I want red or white, or tap them both for the same color, but if I'm holding M, it simply taps for red. When you're holding M, any land you click will add their default mana, as decided by what appears first on the card itself. Lands with activated abilities function similarly. If I normal click the Foundry of Consuls, it will ask me if I want to tap it for colorless or use its big ability. But if I'm holding M, then it will simply tap. One thing to note about these lands is that if you click the spell first before tapping your lands, then it won't bother asking you if you want to tap it or activate it, since it knows you're trying to cast the spell. But the dual lands will still ask you what color you want if you aren't holding M. This may not seem like a huge deal, but if you think of it in terms of saving you multiple clicks for every spell you cast, you can see how quickly it could add up. And since matches have chess clocks, you can see how that might matter. The second set of hotkeys use the function keys along the top of your keyboard. F2 will be your most pressed key, as it is the key to pass priority or say OK. We'll come back to F3, but F4 says pass until you can respond. This means that you are effectively removing all of your stops for the rest of that turn. It will still give you priority if your opponent does something or something goes on the stack, but if the stack is empty, you will not receive priority even if you have a stop set. F5 simply shows you all of your face-down cards while you hold it, such as morphs. Not extremely useful, as you could simply mouse over any you'd want to see anyway. Remember in our illustrative game how I kept right-clicking the battlefield and selecting yield until end of turn when I didn't want to do anything else? That's F6. F6 is the nuclear version of F4 in that you won't even get a chance to respond if your opponent does something. Hitting F6 means you have absolutely nothing to do for the rest of the turn no matter what. If you have a bunch of mana untapped or cards in hand, you might think about using F4 instead, or manually hitting F2 a bunch so that your opponent doesn't know that you don't have anything you could play. But if you're tapped down or your hand is empty, F6 can save you a lot of clicks and a lot of clock time. Now that you know about F4 and F6, F3 is your panic button. This cancels the effects of F4 and F6, but if you accidentally hit F6 and your opponent has F4 or F6 active themselves, or just moves very quickly before you undo it, then the turn will already be passed before you can hit F3. A lot of the time you'll get a chance to hit it as your opponent is making plays, but not always, so be careful with F4 and F6, and don't rely on F3 to save you. Remember when both of my Secret of the Void triggers had to go on the stack and I had to select them one by one? Well, sometimes a card will have to put a handful of the same trigger on the stack at the same time, and the interface will ask you to put them on the stack individually in order in the same manner. Rather than clicking each individual one, you can hit F7 and it'll put them all onto the stack for you. F8 will disable bluffing for that game, meaning that whenever you have no spells you could play or activated abilities you could activate, including lands you could tap, then it will automatically pass everything for you so you don't have to worry about F6ing. I know a ton of players who swear by F8 and use it every single game, but personally I never use it. For one, with my minimalist stop setup, I get into rhythms of hitting F2, and if a game passed for me thanks to F8, then my F2 key press could apply to the next dialog box, and I'd pass when I didn't mean to. The second reason I refrain from F8ing is that it has been bugged in the past with such things as Convoke, and I'd rather go through with hitting F6 myself than risk missing a play. Then there are two options that are unbinded by default, but both can be found in-game by right-clicking the ability you want to apply it to. Always yes to this can be used on a yes or no prompt, and it will hit yes then, and each time that same exact ability from the same source is put onto the stack. Always yield to this is the same, but instead of hitting yes, it simply automatically passes priority. Again, it has to be the same exact ability from the same exact object. Once these are enabled, both can be cancelled by hitting F3. All of these key bindings can be custom done by simply clicking unbind, bind, and then the new key you want to use for that hotkey. You can redo any of these bindings whenever you'd like, and you can click Restore Defaults at the top of each of these menus to go back to the original hotkeys. I'll walk you through my hotkey setup and the reasons behind them, but feel free to change it up based on how they feel to you. Getting used to hotkeys is a big part of playing Magic Online, and doing so early will help you a lot in the long run. F9 and F8 used to be yes and no respectively, but now the default is Alt-Y and Alt-N for some reason. It may be tempting to just put Y and N, but for final decisions you can't go back on like this, I'd advise against something you may just type naturally thinking you had Facebook chat selected, but made an in-game decision instead on accident. Also, I don't like using Alt for hotkeys, as there are computer functions that use Alt which I don't want to overlap with. Lastly, with your right hand on the mouse, things like Alt-Y and Alt-N are not the most natural one-handed keystrokes. I prefer using a smaller range of keys near each other on the left side of the keyboard, as well as the F keys. For a long time I had my yes as Control-A for affirmative, and Control-S for sorry, no thanks. If you want to minimize misclicks, Control-D for don't even also works. But now I unbinded help and look at face down cards and rebinded F1 as yes, which is conveniently right next to F2, and F5 as no. I use the default Z for zoom as there's no risk of it being a common key since it doesn't actually do anything if you hit it on accident. Escape for cancel works fine, as does Control-Z for undo. Both are very natural if you're an avid computer user. Since my hand is on the left side of the keyboard, I have auto tap rebinded to E for easy mode. I have all of these the same, then always yes to this and always yield to this as F9 and F10 respectively. Even though I use the always X to this abilities often, I admit to just right-clicking instead of using the assigned hotkey. Another thing I use a lot in the right-click menu is the Attack All button, which doesn't have a hotkey but is very useful. It will declare all of your legal attackers as attackers, but not confirm it. So if you had a bunch of creatures and wanted to attack with all but one, you could right-click, Attack All, then deselect the one you wanted to keep back. Very handy. The last hotkey you need to know is not on this page but is still very important, and that's holding control. This does two things. As you are casting a spell, holding control will help you be very specific about the mana you're making and using by adding it to your mana pool one by one and then letting you pay the cost out of that pool one by one. This is important if you have weird mana floating and need to keep the right colors. The other use for holding control is to maintain priority. This is for when you want to respond to your own action. In Magic, you technically get priority first when you cast your spell, but an overwhelming majority of the time, you are immediately passing that priority. So much so that Magic Online does this by default, so on the rare occasions where you do want to respond to your own action before passing, you do so by holding control. You'll hear Magic Online commonly referred to as MODO, which is a vestigial acronym for an early name for the program that has stood the test of time, Magic Online Digital Objects. You're almost ready to be let loose into the wilderness of MODO. All you need to know now is how to find a game. Go back to the play lobby, and the filters on the left have 3 game types: Constructed open play is where you can look for other players for matches. You can go into different rooms based on how experienced you are with the program and how competitive your deck is. Once you're ready for constructed tournaments, go to that tab and you'll see these three options. Queues are either 8-person single elimination tournaments or 2-player heads-up matches. There's even a queue called the New to Magic Online Standard that uses your new player tickets. Scheduled will give you a list of tournaments that start at a certain time. Be sure to click the starting time widget at the top to sort the list of events. Daily Swiss tournaments are simply 4-round tournaments that pay based on record. There are various other scheduled tournament types, and going over all of them would have to be its own video, so you can explore them for yourselves by double-clicking a tournament to open its lobby. This will show you the entry fee at the bottom, a countdown to when it starts, and if you click on this little prize structure button, it will launch your browser on a page with all of that tournament's information. And lastly, leagues are 5-round tournaments that pay out by record, but unlike the Daily Swiss events that are 4 rounds in a row from the scheduled start time, you can join a league whenever you want and play your matches whenever you'd like. Very convenient and the best bang for your buck. Limited tournaments give you the same options, but the league is sealed deck, as are pretty much all of the scheduled tournaments, while the queues are mostly drafts. You can see the various formats as well as the different prize structures. If it says single elimination, then 1 loss and you're out, but if it says Swiss, then you can play all 3 rounds no matter what. If it says Phantom, then you don't get to keep the cards you draft, but if it doesn't say Phantom, then all of the cards you draft will be added to your collection after the tournament. Some of the more competitive queues will also say Fast Build, which means the clock for the deck building portion of the tournament are much shorter. As you can see, there's a third option for joining limited events in addition to just event tickets or just play points. You can also join with a couple of event tickets and the requisite product. The reason this is important is because bots will often sell packs for less than the $4 they cost at the store, so if you have the time and patience, you can save some change by buying tickets, then buying packs with said tickets from bots to enter the event. But what we're after is the new to Magic Online Phantom Swiss draft. You can join the draft by paying the entry fee at the bottom, and you'll see your name added to the list. Normal drafts are 3 rounds and fire when the queue hits 8 players. The new player draft is just a 2-rounder and fires when the 4th player enters. When it does, the draft starts automatically, and the draft screen looks like this. As always, you can resize the parts of the window and use the slider to adjust the size of the cards. You can see the main card window is the booster pack you've opened, and the bottom is the cards that you've drafted, split into main deck and sideboard, but those are just temporary spaces for your convenience. Along the left side are the players in the draft and the flow of the packs, as well as this little graphic to show you what pack you're on. In the corner of the main card window is the pick clock, which is the amount of time you have to draft a card. If you run out of time, it will take a card at random, but you can reserve a card by single clicking it, which will give it this bluish border. It will even tell you in the bottom of the window what card is reserved. The text draft recorder we talked about earlier will also show all cards you reserve before you make your pick, which is pretty awesome. Reserving a card means that if you run out of time, it will take that card instead of a random one. In addition to the slider, you can also zoom in on these cards, but again, I recommend using the zoom button and mousing over rather than middle or double clicking because it lowers risk of accidentally drafting the card that you're trying to look at. Right clicking will tell you to put it in your main deck's pile, put it in your sideboard area, or reserve it. You can take a card by double clicking it or dragging it into the lower window, and you can drag it to either the main or the side. In addition to main versus side, you also have the ability to drag cards around in the bottom window or sort them in the right click menu by color, converted mana cost, or rarity. If your cards are sorted in this fashion, then any picks you make via double clicking will be put into its sorted slot, or you can just drag it wherever you want it to go. You can see it tells you how many cards you have in this section, as well as how many are lands and how many are creatures. You go through the draft, and after the 3rd pack is finished, it brings you to the deck building screen with your main and side split up the way you had them in the draft window. One special sorting function in this window that is extremely useful is group creatures separately, which does exactly that. This is great for keeping track of what your creature curve actually is. Be careful though, as both this grouping and the number telling you your creature count can be deceiving, as something like Dance with the Devils will not be counted and will be sorted into the lower window, despite functionally being a creature majority of the time. The clock is of course how long you have to submit your deck. Once you're ready, the Add Basic Lands button is along the top, and when you click it you'll get the lands window with the suggested spread already inputted. But as I said last time, you should not blindly trust these suggestions, as they don't account for a lot of factors that could matter, such as how much fixing you have or the cost of activated abilities and so on. Once you have the lands and your deck is 40 cards, the submit button lights up and becomes clickable. Even after you submit, you'll still be able to make changes and resubmit for as long as the round hasn't started, which it usually will once all players in the draft have submitted their decks. It will put you right into your first match against your first round opponent and it's game on. When you finish, your prompt will say return to details, which brings you back to the lobby for that draft. The info along the left will give you an idea of how long until the round is over. Once all the matches are complete, there's a 2-minute break before the next round begins. events. Since these new player drafts are just 2 rounds, when this one is done, the event is over. I was fortunate enough to go 2-0, so I got 5 of these 5 card boosters as prize. This event is Phantom, so you don't get the cards you draft, but in the non-Phantom drafts, this prompt window will also include the cards in your pool in addition to any prize you might have won. And there you have it, your complete guide to getting started on Magic Online. So what's next? Well, one of the best ways to improve at Magic and get better at using the client is to watch streams and videos. NewmontGaming.com is the website that made this video possible, and also happens to be the home of the content of myself and the biggest streamer in Magic, Kenji Egashira, aka Newmont the Nummy, as well as a bunch of other Magic pros and personalities, so check it out. I'll leave both of our Twitch links in the description as well, along with a table of contents, which you can also find in the first second of this video. I plan on doing a lot more beginner-friendly content, so leave any questions you might have and I'll try and answer them in a future video. Till then, thanks for watching and happy motoing!